Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you, Jonathan, for organizing this wonderful event. My talk will start with this person, even though he's actually the culmination of my talk. A certain man by the name of White Wolf, allegedly a Kickapoo Indian from Kansas, who, clad in festive dress of his tribe, was staged within the frame of the so-called Czechoslovak ethnographic exhibition, which took place in Prague in 1895. And I just mentioned in one of my texts the appearance of this Indian in the middle of exhibition that was actually focused on the richness and diversity of Czech culture and its participation in the great development of the Slavic tribe and Slavic race. And in the midst of those costumes and old houses, there is this Indian. So how did he appear there? What did it mean for this particular stage of development of the Czech entanglement with the overseas? So when Jonathan was interested in this, I also started to dig, and I revealed some interesting connections. So I will talk about the general idea of Indian in the Czech milieu and then return to White Wolf. I just need to remind you that all this takes place before the Buffalo Bill's White Blood Show, which of course changed the situation for the perception of the Indian, and also before the publication of the first translations of Karl May novels to Czech, which also changed the image of the Indian and its representation. There certainly were cases of chances to see real American Indian in the Czech lands. Judging from the preserved testimonies, they were not presented in a way different from other primitives. So their diversity was reduced into few features: semi-nakedness, fierceness, body mutilation, and so on. So around 1800, certain Englishmen brought to Prague botocudo, Brazilian botocudos, man-eaters, singing songs and so on. Then, however, one of the spectators recognized in the botocudos 3 farmhands from a village in southern Bohemia, and the Englishman took to his heels with the money and the Indians. So this is an interesting story because it shows the popularity of the real botocudo show in London, and it's sort of spreading of the news of the Indian botocudo all over Europe. But the hints on fake Indians eating raw meat appeared in the comments of performances of real North American natives all throughout the 19th century, up to the beginning of the 20s. So this is interesting because actually also the other stagings of the American natives up to the second half of 19th century had this hint of fakeness. It's not real. I don't know if there is any lover of classical music, of Czech opera, but the most famous Czech opera, Barter Bride, which is a very sentimental story set precisely in a village, in a very romantic country village, country setting. After surprise revelation, true love prevails over scheming parents and so on. But there is the important appearance of traveling circus. And within the circus, there is this Indian chief Muru, again a cannibal and man-eater. This photo is, of course, from a later period, from the 1930s, but you can see again, the feathers as a great mark of the Indian. And even though this particular Indian is not directly revealed as fake, the bogus of the whole performance is made clear by the fact that another stage highlight, a bear, who is the highlight of the performance. The bear is found drunk, deadly drunk, in a pub, and so cannot perform. And this news is revealed precisely by the Indian. So the shows of real Indians are actually openly deceitful. And in contrast, the printed sources that are creating another image of Native Americans are supposedly more truthful and more realistic, often presented as eyewitness accounts. So this is this image of noble savages, proud, gentle, and living in harmony with nature. Great impact, of course, in this direction had the translations of book by James Fenimore Cooper, available in German since the 1820s and in Czech since the 1850s, the first of them being the last of the Mohicans. Just to show you, we don't have often the proof that the book was really read. This is the picture of the first edition of The Last of the Mohicans in Czech, and not only, this is the last page of the book, not only it was, I don't know if you can read it, but not only it was read, but it was apparently read at school, because you have physics notes in the book. So it's from the collections of Czech National Library, but apparently got there from private collection. So this was really read by the youth. For Czech readers, as of course readers elsewhere in Europe, Cooper coined the scenery for the adventurous stories, that of the great woods and lake shores of northeast of North America, and especially such attributes of the real Indian as canyon, bar axe, tomahawk, wigwam, Huron, war cry, and the peace pipe, calumet. And of course the important topic was that of vanishing race, rapidly passing away before the onslaught of civilization, which appealed to the Czech readers a lot, as I will explain. And of course, the topic of the vanishing race was then taken over not only by writers, but also by illustrators, painters such as George Catlin and Karl Bodmer, whose images were further reproduced and plagiarized for illustrations, both in the journals and cheap books. But of course, Catlin and Bodmer are already choosing different setting for their vanishing Indian, that of the Great Plains of American West. As a consequence, and also due to the Indian Wars that became a popular theme for adventurous books in various languages, and also the Great Migration Wave that was directed partly to the Great Plains. In the second half of the 19th century, also in the Czech setting, the noble Indian became Sioux rather than Mohican, Delaware, or Iroquois. And we can see the vacillation between the Great Woods and the Great Plains. In the 1950s, Czech intellectual Adalbertus Fingerhut of Vojta Náperstek, later founder of the museum of the same name, traveled to the United States, and thanks to him, probably the first eyewitness accounts on the Indians were delivered to the Czech public. He visited shortly before the famous Dakota Uprising in Minnesota. He was part of the official delegation of the federal government to Minnesota. He brought several objects which are nowadays still preserved in the museum. And of course, these objects perfectly fit with Catlin's and Bodmer's image of the Indian. So it's actually confirming the stereotypes rather than changing them. Náperstek himself especially accentuated the bravery of the Indians and their love of freedom. And bravery, of course, was a topic rather frequent, especially in adventurous literature. And in Czech lands, you have the colonial fantasies very similar to those that Susan Sontag described for the Germans before they actually launched their own colonization. So you have adventurous books where the Czech migrants are the main protagonists. So here the story of the chief Bull-Eye of the Sioux. The story is located shortly after the battle on the Little Big Horn. This noble guy who saves the Indian chief after he was wounded by the Yankee trader who tried to cheat the Indian. And so these colonial fantasies, of course, present the Czechs as part of the advancing civilization, even though they are the more human and the more enlightened than the cheating Yankees. It's very similar to what Karl May was writing afterwards. But in the end, of course, the Indians are doomed to perish. And even though you could pity the Indian, even though you could call for a more human treatment of the Indian, nevertheless, you stood on the opposite side of the civilizational divide. This is the same message that's contained in the testimony of a young Czech poet, Josef Václav Sládek, who traveled in the United States in the 1860s, and he admired American happiness, he admired American democracy and political freedom, but that something is wrong with this democracy became clear to him when visiting the West. So you have again the motive of the vanishing Indian, you have the motive of the Indian graves, which is really interesting because the motive of the graves is also very common in Czech construction of their own nationality, the graves of the past Czech kings, which are the testimonies of the past greatness of the independent Czech kingdom. And what is interesting, Slavik also translated to Czech the epos, the Song of Hiawatha, the epos by Longfellow. And so we can see here again the persistent oscillation between the great woods and the plains. And of course, also the Song of Hiawatha contains a gloomy vision of the future, or rather lack of future, of the native tribes of America. Slavik accentuated the scenery, the colorful American nature. Actually, the translation of the poem was first designed to Czech migrants so that they can get better terms, both with the nature and with the natives they are meeting in the West. And the translation of the Song of Hiawatha inspired a prominent Czech painter, Mikuláš Aleš, who was famous beside, this was just a side work for him. He was famous for his representations of all this Czech history, Slavic mythology, and also the country culture, the village culture of the natives. So here's the series called The Elements, featuring Indian men in fearless struggle with the nature, but also the impending doom. So you can again see the canoe, not here, but there's another picture with the canoe, the feather dress, so the Indian is fighting the bear in the festive attire, and here, of course, the impending doom. And that now it gets interesting because Aleš explicitly compared the Indians to the Baltic Slavs, which was the Baltic Slavs was a tribe or a nation that in the Middle Ages was wiped out by the advancing German colonization. So here we could, at the first sight, there's a clear parallel. You know, the Czechs are, you know, brothers, or the Indians are brothers to the Czechs because they are in the same situation as those Slavic brothers. But actually, how I read it, this is a warning. Don't end up like this. You know, it's a warning to the Czech nation to be strong, you know, and to, let's say, to get to the right side of the civilizational barrier. It's the memento to the Czechs in their fight with Germans. We should not forget that this is also the period of the great admiring of Darwinism, and, you know, the stronger prevail. So the general image of the Indian was thus of the nation destined to rapid extinction, and the general opinion of the Czechs was that of pity and sense of superiority, but sometimes the Indian could even embody a primitive, stupidly trying to hinder the advancement of civilization, reason and progress. This is interesting in two senses. First, how precisely the paintings were plagiarized and reprinted, and this is the Germans in Bohemia who are opposing the Czechs trying to push through the linguistic equality, you know, the equality of Czechs with Germans. So Indians throwing logs under the advancing trade. So this is the idea of the image of the real Indian at the moment when the ethnographic shows of human zoos are coming to Europe. And of course the principle of the ethnographic show was the authenticity. So it's contrast to those previous fake shows and fake appearances. So now we have the real Indian, but as we will see, you know, these real Indians actually clash with the existing images, and the audience is sometimes disappointed. So in 1879, German entrepreneur Charles Reich brought to Europe a troop of Iroquois from Canada, accompanied by a Comanche Mexican, because the Iroquois, they could present lacrosse and canoeing, but there was also the need for horsemanship and for the real Indian to show himself. And so this appearance of, you know, this you can see in the promotional text that on the one side there is this impending doom that, you know, the spectators try to detect with the Indians, and also interesting is that, you know, the dress of Spanish hidalgos, the dressed as Spanish hidalgos. You can see that actually it did not look much like Spanish hidalgo, but that's probably the commentator never seen the Spanish hidalgo. But anyway, here you see the comment that gave the name to my presentation, that they seem neither red enough nor fierce enough. They did not correspond to those images. And yeah, I don't have time to go to this, but I will now. This leads to this appearance of an Indian in the midst of the ethnographic exhibition. Why? Because now we are returning back to the ethnographic exhibition in 1895. You see, it was a really big exhibition, which did not only feature the houses and the music bands, but it also featured something called American settlement, which was to prove not only the global outreach of the Czech nation, but also the advancement of the Czech nation. And actually, the American settlement was presented in a developmental way. There was demonstrated the progress of the migrant from the primitive sod house through a farm to a city residence with all those advancements of American industry, folding beds and so on. And also there was this Indian. And so instead of the previous ethnographic shows, where these Indians were brought from the outside, this one was actually brought by the migrants themselves. So the whole event could mimic the great industrial and colonial exhibitions of the developed nations, and the Czechs actually had their own colonial subject. And so you see that again, some of the comments were really interesting. In spite of his Indian origin, he's a very polite person. And of course, because then after the closing time, because there were also the villagers who were staging their primitive purity on the exhibition, and after the closing time, they all went together for a pub for a beer and teaching the Indian their songs. And even though there were again efforts to find in him, the sadness of the vanishing race, it did not happen that easily. And what is really interesting is this colonial discourse, this colonial complicity of the Czechs. So the Indian accompanied the immigrant back to his own homeland. The Indian is domesticated by the Czech immigrant, and at the same time, in the log house where the Indian was staged, you could not only, and there was a special entry fee to this log house, besides the general entry fee to the exhibition. And here you not only could buy a small trifles that the Indian was making at a spot, but also you could see a small exhibition where there were scalps. There was the saber, alleged saber of General Custer, but there were also some pants from some famous American bandit. And you can see in this commentary that actually these horrible Indian scalps should not scare us, because we Czechs never participated in this colonial venture. So there's this double speak in this one quote, and I'm drawing to the end. Because all this is very specific for a very particular phase of Czech national awakening at the very last decades of the 19th century. But on one hand, the industrial development within the Czech lines and the great migration wave promoted these efforts to actually get at equal terms with the great colonizing nations of Western Europe, to prove the value of the Czech nation via this at least symbolic scientific culture colonization. After the year 1900, the situation changes, especially with the acquisition of Bosnia and Herzegovina by the Habsburg crown, because many of the Czech entrepreneurs, many of Czech bureaucrats actually take part in the taming of Bosnia and Herzegovina and turn their energies and turn their interest into this, I would say, inner colonization within the European continent. And so there is a market, even though there's also the great interest precisely within the frame of the Buffalo Bill shows, the Karl May novels, but the Indian again becomes unreal. It again becomes far away. So this is the only occasion when actually the Indian was brought home, as I said, as was the case of many of the colonial exhibitions in France or elsewhere where the natives were actually domesticated into the local context. Thank you very much.